All righty. Good evening, and we are once again continuing our studies on human government, going way back very early in the process, looking at Israel as we saw a week ago, they made demands to have a king so they could be like all the other nations. And God had agreed to grant their desires, but along with that, he gave some words of warning through Samuel the prophet, warnings of what it would be like once they had a king, once they embraced on this stage of human government, away from God as their sole leader in a theocracy. In this case, God warned them there would be a mandatory draft, that the best of the young men would be taken to be soldiers. There would be property that would be taken away, the same idea as what we know today as taxes. There'd be a loss of personal freedom. And maybe most severe and most somber here, there was a warning that once they embraced on this, there would be no reversal. Once they started into human government, there would be no turning back. This was one of those decisions where you don't get to try it for a month or a year. He said there will be no reversal. So let me ask you a question as we get into this. How many of you, with a raised hand, like having a president? Okay, just about everybody. There's one or two that don't like having a president. How would you like to have a king instead of a president? Anybody? Nobody wants a king. What would make you nervous about having a king? Okay, not elected, and so you like the idea of having some say in who your president is. Did you choose your president this time around? Not this one, but you did have a choice, at least. You had a vote. What would be the problem with having a king that you didn't get to elect? Okay, and so with a president, there's power. With a king, there's pretty much absolute power. A president, in our system of government, there are some checks and balances, some limits as to what that individual can do. One of the things that makes the whole thing an issue at all, a president, a king, some of you mentioned you like the idea of having a choice. And why is having a choice so important? Okay. In other words, there are good officials and there's bad officials, right? And we feel like at least if I have a choice, I can help to, in my small way, to vote for the one that I would choose. In the case of a president, if you had a really great president, you might be tempted to say, man, it's too bad he can only be president for 8 years, because we'd love to have this guy longer. If you had a really good king, you might say, this is the most wonderful form of government, because, man, this guy is awesome, and he's been king for the last 24 years, and he's still pretty healthy. He might be king for the next 20 or 30 years. Would that be a good thing? Yeah, if he's a good, godly king, it's wonderful. The problem is there's good officials and there's bad ones, and there's nothing that guarantees you're always going to have a good one. A bad king is even worse than a bad president because, as somebody said, there's not a lot in the way of checks and balances. So anyway, it was therefore very important when Israel was going to get their first king. There's a lot of lessons that God has for them, and it has to do with this whole issue we're talking about. a good king is going to be a huge blessing, but a bad king is going to be a huge curse on the people and on the land. And so anyway, I'm sure you all realize the first king who was selected was Saul. And would you turn with me to 1 Samuel 9? 1 Samuel 9, verses 1 and 2. Now there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah, the son of a Benjamite, a mighty man of valor. He had a son whose name was Saul, a choice and handsome man. And there was not a more handsome person than he among the sons of Israel. From his shoulders and up, he was taller than any of the people. What do you see? We know that he became the first king. What do you see in those two verses that indicate that he might be quite appealing as a king? Okay. You're in verse 2. Okay. Choice and goodly or handsome is the idea. He was a real good-looking dude. What a person looks like does have a way of either turning off people or getting them excited and say, wow, this guy, he just looks like a winner. What else? We know he was handsome. In fact, it says he was extremely handsome in another portion. Okay, yeah, he was taller than everybody. And why was that important? Okay, yeah, good. Something of an air of authority, just that he's tall, maybe, but also if he's taller than everybody, if he's bigger, there is the thought that he'll be a great fighter, he'll intimidate the enemy, he'll be a good leader, he'll be a good warrior. And there's one more thing that's mentioned in verse 1. Where did you see that, Kelly?
There was an influential man.
Okay, that's curious. I don't have anything like that, but mine just says there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish. Oh, a mighty man of valor. Is that ESV you're using? Okay.
Mine says the Benjamite, a mighty man.
I'm assuming where it says a mighty man of valor, that's where it's plugging that in early. Yeah, and that would certainly be good too. It's the idea. I believe it's not talking about Saul there. I think it's talking about his dad. But usually what a person's dad is like can give you some idea of what the son might be like. If the dad has got a great reputation, you're going to figure, well, his son is probably going to be the same kind of stuff. It does mention also, the idea here, talking about his dad, a mighty man of valor. He's a great warrior, and Saul has the right genes in that sense. You know, it's probably a chip off the old block. Look at a chapter over, chapter 10, verse 24. It says, Samuel said to all the people, do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? Surely there is no one like him among all the people. So all the people shouted and said, long live the king. So who chose Saul? Okay, the Lord did. Now look at chapter 12, verse 13. Samuel saying to the people, now therefore, here is the king whom you have chosen, whom you have asked for. And behold, the Lord has set a king over you. So Okay. It's a little tricky. The one clearly says God chose him for you, and the other text clearly says this is the one that you chose, speaking to the people. But I think the issue is along the line of what Jan's saying there. It's God gave them the perfect example of the kind of person they wanted, if that makes sense to you. He could say, this is the one the Lord chose, and he chose that one knowing what you wanted and who you wanted. And then he could turn to the people and say, this is the one you chose, because he was exactly in keeping with what they wanted. They wanted somebody who could fight their battles. They wanted somebody who even of the right family line, a great warrior, stuff like that. And so God is saying, this is the one you chose, but he's also saying it's the one I chose in order to fulfill your desires and your demands, which essentially is to say that sometimes God gives us what we demand, which may not be what's ideal for us. I don't know if you've ever grappled with that reality, but it is dangerous to demand something of God in prayer, and God could easily say, nope, not happening. But sometimes he grants us our desire or even our demand, even though he knows that ultimately we're going to be sorry. Such was the case of Saul. Now I'd like to read verses 17 to 27 of chapter 10. And this is, Samuel calls the people together and basically says, this is the king that you chose. Beginning verse 17, 1 Samuel 10. Thereafter Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah, and he said to the sons of Israel, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought Israel up from Egypt, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the power of all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But you have today rejected your God, who delivers you from all your calamities and your distresses. Yet you have said, no, but set a king over us. Now therefore, present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans. And thus Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. And then he brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its families, and the Matrite family was taken. And Saul the son of Kish was taken. But when they looked for him, he could not be found. And therefore they inquired further of the Lord, has the man come here yet? So the Lord said, behold, he's hiding himself by the baggage. So they ran and took him from there, and when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward. Samuel said to all the people, do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? Surely there is no one like him among all the people. So all the people shouted and said, long live the king! And then Samuel told the people the ordinances of the kingdom and wrote them in the book and placed it before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, each one to his house. Saul also went to his house at Gibeah, and the valiant men whose hearts God had touched went with him. But certain worthless men said, how can this one deliver us? They despised him and did not bring him any present. But he kept silent. What do you think of the fact that he kept silent? Yeah, probably one of the smarter things he ever did, to exercise self-control. Probably it's not great the very first day that you're coming into power to find some people that aren't on your side and decide they need to have their heads cut off. There are some problems with Saul, and we're going to look at that. Turn over to chapter 13. And Saul had several failures, but this initial one was the one that spelled doom to his role as king in Israel. Verses 1 to 8. The part we looked at so far was Saul being selected. In this case, we're going to see Saul stressed. Very early in his reign and rule as king. Verse 1. Saul was 40 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 32 years over Israel. Now Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel, of which 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, while 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah of Benjamin. But he sent away the rest of the people, each to his tent. Saul smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. And then Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." And all Israel heard the news that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become odious to the Philistines. The people were then summoned to Saul at Gilgal. What does that mean, the people of Israel had become odious to the Philistines? And so Saul, in attacking them, it'd be kind of like if you can imagine a junior high playground, and you got this one kid who's kind of the playground bully, and he's bigger and stronger than everybody else, and a guy who's clearly weaker and smaller goes up to him and shoves him into the wall. What's likely to happen? Well, the big guy, you got him stirred up now. It's kind of like you stirred up a hornet's nest. And that's the idea. It made Israel odious in the sight of the Philistines. They didn't like what Saul had done. Now the Philistines assembled to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people like the sand which is on the seashore in abundance. And they came up and camped in Michmash, east of Beth-aven. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were hard pressed, then the people hid themselves in caves and thickets and cliffs, in cellars and in pits. And some of the Hebrews crossed the Jordan into the land of Gad and Gilead. But as for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. What's going on in Saul's mind right now then? New king. It's real early in his role as a warrior leading the people. And they're ready to fight a major war against a very powerful people. And verse 6 tells us some of the people go hide in caves. Like, okay, they're probably not going to help much. Some of the people in thickets and in cliffs and in cellars and in pits. So all of those ones are basically saying, we're dead. You know, every warrior who shows up for this battle is going to get killed, and I'm just going to hide and hope to save my life. For each one that hides, what does it do to the strength of Saul's army? Yeah, it's like, okay, you maybe lost a couple hundred, maybe 500, who knows how many are hidden away. But all those who went and hid, they're not going to help with the battle. What does it do if you're one of the ones who's still left and you're seeing some of the people running off and hiding? Yeah, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, you know, it'd be like if you showed up for a church workday and you get there and realize the task is huge, and you've only got, we'll say 10 people there to work, and you see 6 of them sneaking off and going back to their cars, and they're going to leave. And it's like, oh no, it was bad already, but now it's even worse. These guys aren't even going to participate. And some of the Hebrews then crossed the Jordan into the land of Gad and Gilead. They're thinking, I'm getting out of Dodge. You know, we'll cross the river and we'll be safe. Obviously, they're not going to help in the battle either. And so Saul, it says he's still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. It's all the ones that are left. They're trembling. They're scared to death. That's like, man, this is not going to be good. Now Saul, verse 8, waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So every day he waits, his army gets smaller, and he's getting more and more nervous and tense. And finally, verse 9, Saul says, bring to me the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. Now Samuel had told him, you wait for me 7 days, and then I'll come and offer the burnt offering. Uh, what circumstances would have really helped to make Saul feel stressed? Okay. The longer he waits, his army's getting smaller and smaller. All the while, the Philistine army keeps getting bigger and bigger. People realize, hey, there's going to be a big slaughter. And in battle, an interesting feature that we don't usually think about, whoever wins gets all the spoil. And it'd be like, if you attacked, in a small sense, if you attack somebody's house, if you beat everybody of that household, you get to take away everything that's there and it's yours. Well, that's the way battles worked in the Old Testament. And that was generally a soldier's pay, is basically all the good stuff that he could carry away. If he wins, it's his to take home to his family. If he loses and gets killed, then obviously you're not taking anything home with you. So anyway, Saul's army is very confident, and it's getting bigger by the day. The Philistine army. Saul's army is scared to death, and it's getting smaller by the day. And Saul is really new at this whole thing about being a general of the army, the leader of the army. He's getting more and more nervous and fearful, and he's thinking, the one person who is higher than me, who I can lean on for help, is Samuel. Samuel was the one who judged Israel all those years. All the people would respect Samuel. They would obey him. He was the one that went and got Saul and said, the Lord's chosen you to be the king. And he's waiting for Samuel. And Samuel said, I'll come within 7 days. Well, apparently it is right near the end of the 7th day, and he hasn't come yet. And Saul finally says, my goodness, if I wait any longer, there won't be any army left. And so he calls for the burnt offering and the peace offering, and he offers the burnt offering, and that was going to be what Samuel did. Well, we get into verse 10. It came about as soon as he finished offering the burnt offering that, behold, Samuel came. Like, oh no. Now he comes. And Saul went out to meet him and to greet him. Samuel said, what have you done? And Saul says, because I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the appointed days, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not asked the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. Saul had been instructed to wait for Samuel, so Samuel could offer the sacrifice and give instructions for battle. But he didn't seem like he was coming, and Saul, basically scared to death, takes things into his own hands. Immediately after he does, Samuel shows up, and he rebukes Saul, and Saul's answer is essentially what? Saul's answer. Yeah, I mean, if you'd have come a little earlier, this wouldn't have happened. And I mean, I didn't really want to do this, but I had to force myself. What's the name that we have for the sin that Saul was guilty of? My question is a little too general, but it's made up of 2 words, and that we. No. Well, I mean, he was impatient for sure, but when you're told what to do and you know what to do, but the circumstances are really, really, really bad, and therefore you say, I can't obey because of this and this and this. We say you fell to the problem, the lure, the temptation of Yeah, I wouldn't even call it self-will, because he didn't want to do it. He was scared to death. But he crumbled to something that you and I face, and government leaders today face, which we normally call situation ethics. In other words, I know what you said, Samuel, and I know that you're the representative of the Lord, but this and this and this was happening, and what was I going to do? And basically he gives excuses for it. Well, as soon as he finished making the sacrifice, Samuel arrived. Samuel says, "What have you done?" Saul, first of all, blames the people. And then he blames Samuel the prophet. And then he blames the Philistines. And finally, in verse 12, he gets around to himself and he says, so I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. In other words, I didn't want to do this, but the people and you yourself, Samuel, and the Philistines get bigger and bigger and closer, and the people were leaving and disappearing, and you weren't showing up, and what was I to do? Again, it's situation ethics, it's deadly. Essentially, when one's behavior is determined by circumstances rather than the unchanging Word of God, that one is headed for trouble. So why did Samuel wait till the last minute? I think you're probably right. I doubt if he was so busy that it's like, oh man, I'm busy here helping a widow, or I'm doing something. I think probably the Lord led him to, nope, don't go yet, just sit tight. Okay, now you can go. And it was a definite test for Saul. It was a test he failed. What role does situation ethics play in 21st century American policy and government? Or are we so good that we don't ever have a problem with that? Are there ways that we do what's wrong because circumstances seem like they demand it?
We always have some kind of to do that.
Well, maybe we personally, but surely our country is a lot better than that. What would be some examples of things in our country that we disobey God's law for situation ethics? No, I don't mean an individual person. I guess one example, the first one that came to my mind, is abortion. Why is abortion legal? Okay. Okay, sure. Good. David?
Not allowed to.
Okay, trying to move religion out of the schools. I mean, trying to separate our actual history from students. Because what would that do? Yeah, it might teach them that our country was once strong, and it was founded on principles of righteousness and justice and a fear of God and respect for the Bible. Mm-hmm.
So if the government wants to
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
$8 trillion in debt, doing better.
the government does a ton of things that
Sure. Yeah, if I go back to where I was going to start with abortion, it's like, why does the government have to say that we're going to keep that legal? Well, because otherwise you're interfering with people's sex lives. And it's like, well, that's not very popular because people want to do what they want to do. And sometimes babies are born that aren't necessarily wanted. And if you end up saying you can never kill a baby or even an unborn baby, then it greatly complicates people's lives.
Well, it's overpopulated already.
The government could say, if that happens and you can't, you're not in a position to raise the child, you can put the child up for adoption, and for the first 5 years, you have to pay for half of the living expenses. Would that be a popular thing? No, the people would say, no, the people will never go for that because the people want to live unrestrained lives and not be punished for it. And basically they want to disobey God but not pay a price, and the government figures out a way to give people what they want. And if you give the people what they want, then they're likely to vote for you. And anyway, that's where we're into today, and we'll finish up, we'll go further from that next week, but today is just this introduction to Saul as the king, and this first major downfall that he has. And at this point, we might say, it seems kind of small. Samuel's going to tell him God has removed you from being king. Obviously, he still was king for, I think it said he was king for 32 years or something like that. So he's still going to be king for a long time. But Samuel is telling him, this one event marked your doom, in which God will oppose you and ultimately replace you. Let's go ahead and close this time in prayer. Heavenly Father, we do recognize that it's not just Saul a few thousand years ago, but every nation, every people group throughout history. And sometimes they're blessed by good rulers, but in other times they're cursed by ungodly rulers who lack principle and lack convictions. And our only hope is the day when Jesus is king, and this one rules in perfect justice and perfect righteousness, and that will be a day of perfect peace. Help us to do what we're supposed to do, as your word says, to pray for our leaders and those who are in authority, but even more than that, to long for the day when Jesus himself will be king.